This is Steve Zeltzer with Workweek in Pacifica, and we have covered the struggle in South Africa and the action of workers in South Africa around the issue of Palestine. And there is going to be a rally at the U.S. Embassy in Johannesburg around the issue of the United States support for Israel and the genocide in Gaza. And joining us is Martin Jensen. He is a activist, leader of a Palestine network or co-leader, and also with Workers World, which is a labor media production group in South Africa. Welcome to our show, Martin.
Hi, Stephen. Hi to all your viewers.
So, Martin, why don't you give us an update on what's happening in South Africa? As you know, there's growing opposition worldwide to the genocide in Gaza and also to the United States support for Israel and against making them be held accountable for the crimes they're committing.
Well, Steve, as you know, we've had a strong Palestine Solidarity movement for several years, for decades, in fact. And of course, what happened after October the 7th reignited that movement in a big way, where literally hundreds, thousands of people have joined the movement. And it's been most consistent over all the years that I've been part of the Solidarity movement. The past year has seen the most consistent activity by hundreds, as I said, thousands of people. Our rallies have been huge. Our marches have been great. The last one we had in Cape Town, it was estimated to be up to 50,000 people. That was on October the 5th. And currently, we are busy preparing for a strong protest action against the US at its embassy in Cape Town. That will happen on Friday, this Friday, the 29th of November, which of course is the International UN Day of Solidarity with Palestine. So lots of groups have expressed support. And in fact, this action is initiated by COSATU, the Trade Union Federation, which we're very pleased about because COSATU has been relatively weak of late over the past decade, and specifically around Palestine, despite the fact over many, many years, COSATU has been a loyal, committed supporter of Palestine's liberation. They haven't been as active as we would have liked them to. And fortunately now, albeit very late, they've come in and they've initiated this action at the American Embassy on Friday. So we think it will be the beginning of a revival of actual labor solidarity, which will strengthen the movement even further and also put pressure on our own government, because the government on the one hand has initiated action at the International Court of Justice, a case of genocide against Israel, but at the same time, they've done very, very little concretely to, impose punitive measures against the Israeli regime. No sanctions at all. The Israeli ambassador is still here. No political ties have been cut with Israel. South Africa is still exporting coal. I think it's the second biggest exporter of coal to Israel. And very little has been done. There's another big issue that we've been pushing for many, many years, over a decade, which is there are lots of young Zionist South Africans who actually serve in the Israeli occupation forces. They've brazenly boasted on social media about the activities, even now during the genocide. And they often come home, for a break, in Johannesburg, Cape Town, they visit their families. And we've brought cases against these people since 2014. And up to now, despite self-incriminating evidence and the fact, we've got a law called the Foreign Military Assistance Act, where it specifies that anyone who wants to serve in a foreign army needs the permission, the consent of the minister. And last year, in fact, was it early this year? we ascertained formally a letter from the relevant Department of Government that not a single person, not a single one of these young Zionists have obtained the necessary permission from the minister. So based on that alone, there's a strong case to be made against them and, prosecution. But the National Prosecuting Authority have actually done nothing up to now to seriously deal with those cases, despite the fact that, there's a genocide, the most brutal genocide that's unfolding. And on the one hand, the government is pursuing a case against Israel for this genocide. And that we find very, very peculiar, very, very strange. And many people are suspicious that our state organs have in fact been influenced and to some extent captured by Zionists in South Africa who are very, very influential, unfortunately.
And also, as you know, there was the struggle of the Clover dairies, which was bought by the Wertheim billionaire family in Israel, that it has dairies on Palestine-occupied land, that it's exporting milk product to South Africa from Israel. It seems that the government, the ANC government, allowed this Zionist-owned billionaire to buy the largest dairy in South Africa, and actually are profiting from exploitation of workers in South Africa.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, that was another huge disappointment with the South African government. The Department of Trade and Industry, what they call the Competitions Commission, enabled and supported this buyout by Milko of probably one of the biggest dairy companies in South Africa, very big, Clover. And subsequently, the company has imposed severe attacks on workers, closing down plants, moving their operations, setting up mainly along the coastal areas. And the suspicion of the union at the time, or its assessment, was that the reason for closing down plants, inland plants, which were the bigger ones, is because the company intended importing dairy products from Israel, so-called occupied territories, importing it and closing down local production, which of course would have serious ramifications for dairy farmers in South Africa as well. So yes, unfortunately, that's another instance where the government has allowed, Zionist companies to not only operate but also attack workers and working class people in South Africa.
And there has also been a recent issue of the Tutu Foundation accepting money from the National Endowment for Democracy at having a conference. And the National Endowment for Democracy, of course, funds the AFL-CIO Solidarity Center. The Solidarity Center has been involved in South Africa. They supported Zulu chief Buthelezi. They helped give him over $1 million for his what were gangs of people who have murdered union organizers. What is the relationship of NED to South Africa, to labor, the history, and what's the most recent struggle around the funding of this conference?
Okay. The conference finished, I think, a day or two ago. And the Palestine Solidarity organizations and others strongly opposed it. We put out lots of press statements. We engaged NGOs that we thought were progressive, had a progressive tradition, particularly the Ahmad Kathrada Foundation. Ahmad Kathrada was a fellow prisoner on Robben Island with Nelson Mandela. And then, of course, the Desmond and Leah Tutu Center as well. But they wouldn't relent. They wouldn't accept, our criticism. We couldn't persuade them. And they decided to continue, kind of in denial of the role of the NED. And in fact, some progressive activists who participated had the notion that it would be better and far more productive to participate in the conference than to boycott it. But since then, there's been even more pressure, particularly the Desmond Tutu and Leah Tutu Foundation, where the legacy arm, which is kind of a legal trust set up for the rights to the image and legacy of Desmond Tutu, they mounted a legal challenge against the partner organization, the Desmond and Leah Tutu Foundation, who were forced then to withdraw from the conference. So that was a kind of a victory. But nevertheless, the local media kind of propped up this conference as something good, something progressive. And what was disappointing is that COSATU also decided to withdraw from the conference, to boycott. However, we believe that the president of COSATU eventually spoke at the conference, which was quite weird. So yeah, the recent articles in, a well-known kind of liberal online newspaper called the Daily Maverick is still perpetuating the lies and the myth about the NED, and putting out kind of articles, favorable articles about it, how good this conference was and the role of the NED, complete denial of its role in promoting US foreign policy, and, kind of the soft counterpart to the role of the CIA internationally, complete denial, and of course lying. So, but for most of us, we rejected it, and we continue to pose, that kind of influence, political influence. And that is borne out by our planned protest at the US Embassy on Friday. And it's happening at all 3 US embassies in Pretoria, in Cape Town, and in Durban. Those are the main ones. And it's quite interesting, the one in Cape Town is like a fortress. It used to be in the city many years ago, and the US government constructed a fortress close to the mountainside, not far from where I live. And you should see it. It's literally a Fort Knox, very isolated, huge barbed wire around it, and so on. And it's always been difficult to protest there, but we are determined this time that we're going to make our, our voices heard and known, and make our position clear to the US government for the role that they've played over many years in relation to Palestine, and specifically now against the genocide that they are in fact perpetuating and supporting.
And what was the relationship of Israel to South Africa during the apartheid regime?
Oh, it was a very, very close relationship. In fact, even in my youth activist days, there were 3 countries that were kind of international pariahs, depending on who they related to. That was South Africa, apartheid South Africa, Israel, of course, and then Taiwan. Those 3 countries cooperated with each other for much of the apartheid era. And as I said, they were extremely close. So there's been research done, a number of articles written about that relationship. And Israel apparently provided South Africa with lots of useful scientific information to produce its own atomic bombs, which it did. So both Israel and South Africa had nuclear weapons. That's just one example, but did lots of exchanges about oppressing people. Both regimes were regimes of colonial settlers of European origin, and they supported each other. They exchanged methods of oppression and control, and that was particularly strong in the 60s and 70s, and it's well documented. There are lots of pictures of these two governments collaborating, working with each other. And interestingly, of course, both had strong support from the USA and reached a high point during the Reagan era. But we know in the case of the US, it's remained committed, loyal to this genocidal settler colonial regime of Israel for many, many decades, since, in fact, probably the 30s and into the establishment of Israel with the Nakba in 1947 and 48, the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, and right up to today, unconditionally supporting the genocide of the Palestinian people as a whole.
And the AFL-CIO, as you probably know, is silent about the genocide, silent about U.S. military weapons by the billions, many billions of dollars being sent to Israel for bombing not just Gaza, but for use in the West Bank and now in Lebanon. And one of the organizations that is supporting this genocide is the Histadrut. Why don't you talk about who the Histadrut is and the relationship of the Histadrut to the apartheid regime in South Africa?
Look, the Histadrut is the Israeli trade union formation. It was formed alongside, and in fact, from the beginning of Zionism, it was formed alongside the Zionist movement. It's closely allied, closely attached to the Zionist movement. And what's interesting about not only the Histadrut, but Zionism, well, it had this facade of socialism through the kibbutz movement. The kibbutz movement was seen as, or was operating, along the lines of so-called, I don't know, I suppose communist or socialist lines, where you had area or village cooperatives where people would live and work together as equals, sharing and building a community. So they had this kind of left-wing socialist facade, but all of this was closely tied to Zionism and settler colonialism in setting up this outpost, which effectively served US and Western interests very well, because if you look at the establishment of Israel, it came just after the Second World War, and it came in the context of the rise of Arab nationalism. As we know, post-Second World War, most colonial oppressed people of the colonies of Europe and other countries like the US were campaigning and struggling for liberation from their colonial occupiers. So Arab nationalism was seen as a huge threat to Western interests in the Middle East. And of course, the Middle East had the biggest supply and reserves of oil, which was, and too much even today, is still the major commodity, the most valuable, profitable commodity, and the most essential commodity for the functioning of the world's economy. It remains oil, fossil fuels. And at that time, it was even stronger. So the Middle East was way too strategic to allow Arab nationalism to dominate, Western interest. And this is why Israel was supported even more, especially by the USA, after the Second World War. And closely tied to this was the Histadrut in this objective, the trade union labor wing of Israel. And it, from the outset, even though it did allow later, Arabs who were living in the state of Israel to become members, it still discriminated against them in various ways, didn't take up the issues, didn't represent the interests, would always side with Israeli employers and the state, and so on. And has been a close partner, as it were, in the oppression and exploitation of Palestinians ever since, and remains so. Now, what's interesting, some years ago, I think COSATU at the ITUC, that's the International Trade Union Confederation, submitted a resolution for the suspension, the expulsion of the history group, but also, more importantly, the resolution was about supporting the liberation of Palestine and support for boycotts, divestment against sanctions, which COSATU was pushing for the international trade unions to support, in the same way that the trade union movement supported the struggle against apartheid. But what happened was the biggest trade union federations of the ITUC strongly opposed it. Of course, the history group itself, but it was the US unions, the Japanese unions, and the German unions, who, as I said, are the biggest. They opposed it, and COSATU's resolution was defeated. Excuse me.
And this relationship of U.S. labor, the AFL-CIO, to continue to support Histadrut in their silence on the genocide, where does that come from?
Look, I suppose you are more familiar with the AFL-CIO than I am. But I think it's clear that for decades, it wasn't always the case, but the AFL-CIO, prior to the two federations coming together, or after, I should say, its leadership has tended to be closely allied to the US government, particularly the Democratic Party. It's kind of similar to the relationship that COSATU has with the ANC, and almost unconditional support for the ANC in this country, and I suppose the same for the Democratic Party in your country. And the Democratic Party has, in many ways, in terms of international and foreign policy, hasn't been much different to the, the Republicans. If we just look at even during the Obama years, the Clinton years, etc., the amount of death and destruction that they brought upon many countries of the world, particularly in the Middle East, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, and of course, supporting Israel, Palestine, and also, the sanctions against Iran and its impact. The Democratic Party is strongly in support of the US imperial role. It has represented US imperialist interests globally, just as well, if not better, than the Republican Party. And this is where the AFL-CIO has committed itself to. It is in full support. I don't know, as a South African, I don't have any record of the AFL-CIO posing strong opposition to any of the US imperialist roles. It's a bombardment of country, the killing of millions of people all over the world. Even during the period of the Vietnam War, I'm not aware of that.
And these actions, national actions at the U.S. embassies and consulates in South Africa, what are you saying to the American people about why you're taking this action?
Well, the US remains the most powerful country in the world. It heads up imperialism. It's literally, for many of us, it's an empire that is hell-bent on exploiting the world's resources. And in doing so, it continuously threatens and imposes its own will, political will, upon many nations of the world through various tactics, economic coercion, political bullying, and of course, open, brutal warfare to promote the interests of its own capitalists, the billionaires in the US, Trump heading up that group now. And in the case of Palestine, it is obvious that it has been supporting Israel for many, many years and unconditionally supporting the genocide. It's continued to provide billions of dollars of arms and weapons to Israel, even when it has itself threatened Israel to stop supplying it with arms, completely deceiving the world. The calls for ceasefire. On one occasion, it did support a ceasefire, a conditional one. But even then, it did not force Israel to adhere to any ceasefire. And it's obvious to us that the US is supporting the genocide of the Palestinian people. And at the same time, for many people across the world, the US is the country that when it invades other countries and coerces them, it does so in the name of democracy and human rights. And it's obvious to the people of the world that this is a complete contradiction. It's a lie. It is completely hypocritical that the main interest of the US is to control and dominate the world's economic resources in the interest of its billionaire capitalist class. And this is the message we want to send out to the world, that we reject in the strongest terms what the US is doing. And we, in fact, calling on particularly the American people and people of the world to internationally create a movement, a united front against US-led imperialism, to put an end to, the legacy of imperialism and colonialism, the racism, the genocides, the invasions, the assassinations of our leaders, the progressive ones, Patrice Lumumba, and many, many others. Even Salvador Allende in '73. The US has been invading countries, staging coups for many, many decades. And we're saying it must come to an end. We are in great danger now, globally. We see that in the case in Europe, there's a proxy war fought by Ukraine against Russia, supported by Europe as well. That holds the danger of, nuclear war. Similarly, the US, supported by its allies like Britain and European countries, are spoiling for a huge war with China because of China's growing economic dominance. That poses another huge threat to humanity, because we know from the experiences of the First and Second World War, that kind of economic competition between these huge powers almost always results in open warfare and destruction. And in the era that we're living in, what does this mean with these advanced nuclear weapons? It could mean the complete annihilation of not only humanity, but life as we know it today on Earth. Coupled with that, we have an environmental crisis, an ecological crisis, where we also face the threat of human, life, the extinction of life. It might be slower, more gradual, but the signs are all there with these extreme weather patterns and destruction, especially in countries in Africa, who don't have the means or resources to recover. We've seen what's happened in Valencia in Spain not too long ago with those floods. We're living in really, really dangerous times for humanity. And at the head of, preventing us from overcoming that and posing a real danger itself is US imperialism and NATO. And we need to deal with that. And the only force that can deal with that is the working class and humanity as a whole. The people themselves will have to deal with these threats.
And the ILWU took action in 1984 against the apartheid regime. They blocked cargo from South Africa. There have been calls by the Palestinian unions for an international labor blockade of Israel. And are there efforts in South Africa for a labor blockade of Israel? I mean, the Zim ship line continues to operate in Durban, other ports in South Africa, as it does in the east coast of the United States. Israel seems to be able to continue to operate economically, and yet workers do have the power, if they want to exert that power, to shut down trade with Israel and close it down.
I fully agree. I think workers and labor action will probably be the most powerful action that will hurt Israel. And if we had international coordination of that kind of action, I think it would bring the Israeli regime down in a very, very short space of time. Unfortunately, our unions in South Africa, transport unions especially, and of course, even globally, the majority are relatively weak politically. In the case of Israel, there's a wariness to openly support the Palestinian cause, let alone take strong action. And we need to do lots of political work to get to the point where workers themselves will recognize the need to support their brothers and sisters in Palestine and elsewhere, and to force the hand of the union leaders to coordinate such action and to lead such action. But as I said, at the moment in South Africa, our transport unions are weak. And in fact, we've tried contacting them as the Palestine Solidarity Movement, but they've avoided us in a really serious way. And I think it's obvious what we are pushing them to do, but they haven't been forthcoming. But we're optimistic that that will change soon.
And the rallies that you're going to have, are they going to be broadcast or streamed live globally so Americans can see the rallies and the statements of the speakers at these rallies, including the unions who are taking this action? And how can Americans get direct information from the organizers of the rally and the speakers?
I will certainly push for that. It is possible. You know, around the US embassies, it's very, very strict in terms of filming and videoing and so on. But I will certainly push for all our groups to stream it and at least to video it and to share it with the rest of the world.
And lastly, you're involved, and you've been involved, like myself, for decades and decades on labor media and building a labor communication network. What would that mean to have an international labor media network that could be broadcast these events and other struggles of workers globally?
Okay. Look, for the past few years, we've been working with what we call the People's Media Consortium, which includes mainly kind of left-wing labor service and NGOs, but also SAFTU, the Trade Union Federation. And it's a Southern African initiative. And what we're doing is twofold. One, we initiating with Cape Town TV, what we call over-the-top TV channels, OTT, which is internet-based television, which means then it can be accessed anywhere in the world as long as you have an internet connection. And the other thing we're doing is training grassroots activists, workers, shop stewards, to be reporters and equipping them with mobile journalism equipment. And we're hoping that by next year, we will have daily news broadcast, what's called social justice news, which of course will include labor, but struggles in the region, but from grassroots level up. And as Workers' World, we will produce the news, but we'll use all the reports that we get from the reporters on the ground. And we're hoping to have at least 100 trained people by next year, including our partners in Mozambique, Swaziland, Zimbabwe, hopefully even Namibia. So that's the plan. But it's not going to stop there. As soon as we've developed the platform and we're functioning well, the likes of you and others in the US will also be reporting for us. And similarly, friends in Europe, Denmark, and elsewhere, Australia, to make it a truly international news broadcast daily, at least 15 minutes every day. And this, of course, will go out internationally.
Very good. And how can people get more information about your initiative? The workers.
They can email me. martin@wwmp.org.za.
Very good. Well, thanks for joining us, and we're glad for the report, and we would definitely like to see the follow-up, the statements, the actions at the U.S. Embassy and Consulates in South Africa, demanding that the United States stop the support for the genocide.
Thanks, Steve.